It's now 15 minutes after the hour of 7 o'clock. Welcome back to the Now Morning Show. Now, this morning we're going to be discussing the connection between abused children and children who come from what can be termed as broken homes to crime in the prison system. With me is criminologist and social psychologist Professor Ramesh Deosaran. Professor Deosaran is a former independent senator, and he's also the former director of the Center for Criminology and Criminal Justice and Psychology Research at the University of the West Indies. Professor, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us on Now.
Hi, good morning. Good morning.
Now, Professor, before we jump in, I just wanted to get your thoughts on the recently released Judith Jones report. I mean, I'm sure you would have read it. Any thoughts on this and some of the things that those children would have had to endure while being at those homes?
You mean their treatment at these homes?
Yes, the mistreatment that they suffered, yes.
Yeah, well, as far as the reports go, these children have not been treated quite well, and most of them are their adolescent stage, a stage where children need a particular kind of care and understanding. But that hasn't happened according to the first report we have from 1997, what is called the SABGA report. And consequently, we had one in 2021, the Justice Judith Jones report. So there are three questions here. Before we reach to the core issue of abuse and the consequences, why are relatively so many children have to be put in these foster homes and these what we call children homes? I mean, the question of parenting is a very serious issue, a very serious responsibility, and it is a lack of good parenting, even as the children themselves said while they're in the homes. Many of them said they have been put in this home because of parents who are not there. About 70% of them live without both parents. Now, that is a tragedy for a country like ours, because the question now arises, having been put in these children homes, I think there's over 40 of them, apart from the foster care homes. You have almost 1,000 children at the last count in these homes. But the issue doesn't stop there. The tragedy begins when these children leave these homes uncared for with what I call broken hearts and broken minds. They have not been properly cared for, so they become very frustrated. They lose their sense of identity, their self-esteem gets damaged. And when they leave these homes, and we haven't had a count, that is where we need to make the connection between when these children uncared for, as they were, leave these homes, where do they end up? It is quite plausible to say, as we have found out in the remand yard, that a large proportion of them end up as delinquents, further delinquents, end up in crime, and the pipeline goes into the prisons. And then in the prisons, they get worse. So you can't stop merely at the conditions in these homes and the care. We have to extend the analysis to find out what happens to these children, having been so uncared for and abused. What happens to them? The answer lies in a lot of crime being committed now. If you retrospectively trace, you will find a lot of these boys and girls who come from these homes get involved in crime and other deviant forms of activity. It is logical. So what we need now is a crusade, as it were, a large-scale effort by the government and these NGOs, the people who manage these homes, to look at what happens afterwards to these children. So that is my serious point. I understand concern over the physical conditions, nutrition, and so on. But the consequence of having been in these homes with broken hearts and living with fractured minds, meaning they have no goal set, they feel very disenchanted, they feel neglected. What do you expect of children leaving a home in such psychological conditions?
But Professor Deosaran, as you mentioned the 1977 SABGA report, I was reading that you actually did a follow-up on the report, I think a few months in 1997 after the SABGA report was published. And you're saying that you had some findings from that report. Can you share what were some of the findings coming out of the report that you did? And also what were some of the recommendations?
This is the report.
Yes.
The findings confirm what I am saying, because just after the Sabga report in October 1997, about 3 months after, the Canadian government, through the Canadian International Development Agency, provided funds for me to do the study, because it appears that the Sabga study was incomplete in the sense that it dealt mainly with the conditions, the physical conditions, and also things like food, nutrition, sleeping facilities, and so on. But the fundamental question is, well, what are the consequences of such conditions on the minds and future behavior of these children? And that is what we entered into doing. We examined the children, not the buildings, because to me the children had equal importance as the buildings. So the question you ask is the fundamental question, and that is what we inquired into. And we found that the children were disenchanted, they experienced frustration, so they had no goal set. They had no goal set, that they were not trained to think about the future. So we discovered all those things, and I believe then, and more so now, that we ought to look at where these children go, because what we have found in the study that we did in October, we produced a report to the government in October 1997. This report went to the government just after the Sabga report, and we advised that both reports be integrated to answer in a more all-round way the fundamental questions of healing the physical conditions, but also healing the broken hearts and minds of the children at the same time. Because there's no sense fixing up the buildings and so on, and the children still remain uncared for with bad management, which is another issue. The people who are in charge of management of these homes, they have to be more properly trained, monitored, and have some accountability, because the consequences upon the children, as we have seen from this report, the report we produced in October 1997, the consequences upon the children are very serious. And it seems as if people, they have to buck up and look at this, as well as what they have looked at, the physical conditions and the staffing and so on. So we thought the report would be supplemental to what the Sabga report had. That is, you look at the physical conditions as well as the psychological state and consequences upon the children. Otherwise, it will be a 0-0 outcome, because
now,
the children
Professor
will leave.
Gilseran,
And they will continue into deviance and wayward behaviors.
now, before we go to the recommendations that you suggested, just walk me through how it happens. So they come from these homes, they might be abused, they might have some self-esteem issues, etc. Is it that they are vulnerable and so they fall in with the wrong crowd? How exactly do they make that transition from the home to a life of crime?
You have hit upon a crucial issue. They are vulnerable psychologically and sociologically. That is, their minds are not strong enough to resist temptation. Socially, they get involved with friends who are also deviant. That is the logical step into which they will move. And with that vulnerability, they enter into gangs, because in gangs they get shelter, they get their self-esteem restored, ironically. They gain some respect from their peers who are also gang members. So we create a new channel, an alternative lifestyle. This becomes an alternative lifestyle to compensate for the psychological deficiencies that they have endured while in these homes. So that is the route we ought to look at. It cannot be a one-stop analysis. It has to have several stops along the way, including the very important point that you made. They are vulnerable to temptation. You see, moral restraint, meaning when you have temptations, you must have the moral resistance not to fall into temptation. And that is important for adolescents to understand and to be trained into. But they haven't had that. So their moral resistance is weak because they have not been shaped into that kind of character in the schools. They have been carelessly looked after. They have just been fed and housed in dilapidated ways from the Sabga report and the Judith George report. So we need to recuperate. and have a new vision about these children because the consequences are very tragic.
Now, Professor, how do they recuperate? Is it as simple as offering therapy or offering, mental health services? Is it as simple as that?
Mental health, it is partly a mental health issue because we saw hope in that. We call these children, in a sense, in the report, children of hope, because some of them understand what's happening. Even though they are vulnerable, there's a piece of their mind that tells them, listen, what is happening is wrong. What is happening will lead me to a deviant future. So we ask them questions like that. What would you like to do? What will be your top priority when you leave here? A lot of them said, well, I like to have more education. I like to have a job. But they didn't say it with the conviction as you would get from somebody in the normal school system. But there's a shadow of possibility there where you can use those responses and build on it, and that could cause some empowerment. So all is not lost. You could build with the little we have in these children from the homes and reshape them into where they would really like to go. Jobs, further education. Of course, they will be left with no parents. So 70% of them, they said they have both parents not at home. Some of them about 10% live by themselves. Could you imagine young boys, 14, 15 years living by themselves? So this whole question of parenting at the beginning and the question of drifting into crime and prison at the other end, we have to connect those two things. And this is a country where people get absorbed in denials. We have all kind of ideology about parenting, and I don't want to get into that now, but the correct thing to do for these children, because there was a related study we did in the primary schools. What would you like to have? Single mother, single father, or both parents at home? And almost 100% of the children, 9, 10 years, told us we like both mommy and papi at home, so to speak. Children want both parents home. This whole thing about family life is not just for a husband and a wife or a man and a woman. The responsibility is primarily upon the children. What will happen to the children? How many children can a house afford?
So,
are you going
Professor,
where are the fathers, for example?
Yeah.
So all these are fundamental questions that we have been in denial for a long time.
Now, there's something that you said where you said that you have to build on the little that they have. Given your experience, have there been any, success stories in terms of any children coming from a home and, who were given the right help and so they eventually, went on to lead as normal as a life as possible?
Of course, there are several success stories. They might not be at the large proportion on the other side, on the dark shadow side, but they are success stories. There are children who have grown up with single mothers, poor, unemployed single mothers. And by struggle and correct behavior, over time, they emerge. Secondary school, they become professionals. There are a lot of lawyers and doctors and engineers and accountants and all skilled carpenters and plumbers who either earn money to look after themselves, who have come from poor homes. I can tell you, I know many of them who have crossed the barrier because of the small impulse they have to do better. It's like a slight heartbeat, but it gets bigger the more you walk on the path of righteousness, as it were. This heartbeat gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And you find
Professor,
your rightful place under the sun. So there are several success stories.
Right, because in terms of the broken homes, I was more thinking about the abused homes, because I know that there are people who come from single-parent homes and they are successful. But I was just wondering in terms of, have there been any success stories of children coming from these abused homes and they're still finding that, that right within themselves to build back their self-esteem and, of course, to be a success eventually?
Yes, I would say yes. We cannot close our eyes to that possibility. But the issue, you see, in social science and in public policy, you look at the majority cases. what you mentioned there is a minority. Successful, welcome, but it's a minority. You have to look at that. But in terms of public policy, you have to attend to the majority of those who are severely abused and where they end up. And that is the challenge facing the country from these homes now. Nice. So there is hope at the same time. But on the other hand, you need a public policy and a new system for accountability, train managers to save these children from future damage.
Professor Deosaran, thank you so much for coming on this show and just sharing a little bit about what we've been seeing in society. It's always a pleasure to have you, and I think we should probably have you back soon again. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, and a pleasant good morning to you.
You too. And that was criminologist and social psychologist Professor Ramesh Deosaran just sharing that connection between broken homes or children's homes and, of course, a life of crime. You're on the Now Morning Show. Up next, stay with us because we have Shamla with Unique, Not Different.
Not later, but